The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, New Paths to Learning, Emerging Trends in Learning and Development. My name is Sarah and I will be helping out with today's webinar. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. This webinar is being recorded. We will provide a link to the recording as soon as it is available. You have joined today's webinar listening through your computer speaking system by default. This means if you can hear music through your computer, you will be able to hear the presentation. If you would like to call in using the phone, just locate your audio pane and select Use Telephone. Dial in information and access code will then be displayed. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and we invite you to ask questions about the presentation using the Questions pane. Simply type in your question and click Send. At the end of the webinar, we will do a question and answer session and take as many questions as possible. Now let me introduce you to our presenter today. Tom Graham is the Senior Director of Leadership and Business Solutions at Global Knowledge. In this role, he leads the design and development of innovative learning and performance solutions to meet unique client needs. This includes consulting services, leadership and organization effectiveness programs, and custom blended and e-learning solutions. Our presentation today again is New Paths to Performance, Emerging Trends in Learning and Development. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Just going to get my slide deck up here. That's good. Everybody see that? Do you see that, Sarah?
I do.
Great. Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for attending. Thank you, Sarah. That was great. So yes, this is a session on new paths to learning, emerging trends in learning and development. You know, as we start to introduce new technologies driven by different kinds of business changes in the work world today, we're starting to look at new ways to get learning to people to accomplish the same kinds of learning objectives we've been accomplishing over the years through traditional approaches to learning, and that includes classroom learning and e-learning. Just before we dive into the presentation, I want to give you a little bit of information about Global Knowledge. Some of you know us better than others. We are one of the leading training and learning consulting companies in the world, and we have an active practice here in Canada. We have three lines of business. We have information technology training and services, business process improvement training, and leadership and business solutions. And some of the services we're going to talk about today fall into our leadership and business solutions line of business. These are the kinds of services that we offer in our leadership and business solutions group. We provide consulting services to develop strategy and learning architectures and roadmaps and help you measure success. We tailor our existing programs to meet your unique needs. We develop completely custom developed programs to meet your objectives and unique learning needs inside your organization. And many of those custom programs are digital these days, and that's some of what we're going to be talking about today. So we offer a full range of digital learning services, including custom e-learning, converting your content for digital solutions, Learning 2.0 or web-based social media types of learning, and finally organizational development, where we help you identify, profile, and develop and manage your talent. We work with a number of Fortune 500 companies across the country in a variety of different sectors, and we've won a number of awards. These are just some awards we've won recently for about 6 years running now with CSTD. We're quite proud of the awards that we've won in conjunction with Deloitte, Rogers, PSP Investments, and most recently an e-learning award with Alberta Human Services. And we'll touch on that a little bit today. So on to our agenda. We're going to talk about 5 what I've called new paths to learning. They include informal learning, which is really the broad umbrella for what we're talking about for the other new paths, including social and mobile. I've lumped them together mostly because I didn't want to have 6 items, but they are very related, and a lot of mobile technologies are used to access social platforms these days. So we'll talk a bit about that. Virtual learning is a very quickly growing form of formal learning, but technology is changing, and we're going to talk about how that's happening. Gaming and simulation are top of mind for most people these days. There are differences in the way companies can approach gaming and simulation. We'll talk a bit about that. And finally, performance support is really just guides and tools and documents available to people at the moment of need while they're doing their work. And we'll talk a little bit about how performance support can be used to support learning and performance and blended with the other new paths to learning. If there's new paths to learning, I suppose that implies that there are old paths to learning or current paths to learning. This is a chart from the most recent ASTD State of the Industry research that they put out each year. And it shows that, at least from a learning and development department perspective, classroom learning is alive and well. That's the turquoise bars that you see there. All the other colored bars are various types of technology delivered formal learning. I put this up because it really communicates that formal learning, and in particular classroom learning, is alive and well. And you can see that that's been true over the last 5 or 6 quite tumultuous years in terms of the changes in technologies that are available to us. So I don't think classroom learning is going away, but it certainly is being enhanced by technology-based learning. And one of the things that we've learned through a lot of research these days is even though learning and development departments, probably your own included, are providing a lot of classroom learning, but when we ask employees how they learn best, most of them are telling us that they learn through experience and informal approaches to learning. So there's a bit of a mismatch there in terms of how we deliver training and how our employees tell us they actually learn best. In this same research study, when ASTD asked their membership over the next 3 years whether they'll be using Web 2 technologies or social media types of tools, there's a vast majority of us that are saying we plan to use them. Now, they're not really being used very much right now, as you saw by the previous chart, but there's certainly a pent-up interest in using new technologies for delivery of learning. And that's the focus of what we'll talk about today. So what are some of the business drivers that are influencing this demand for new types of learning? Well, these are some of the things that we're seeing. You're probably seeing them as well. Of course, technology is always at the forefront of a business driver, and we'll talk a little bit later about new types of social technologies or social platforms that are at use in. Sorry, I just got a little bit of a message on my screen here. Can everybody see that? Sarah, can you see my screen right now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So technology is certainly a key driver. There's some social platforms that are in place that are driving the change to some social and mobile approaches to learning. Of course, you know, with the speed of change in the business world and the emphasis on reducing costs are always a driver for learning, and we have to find ways to get learning to people faster and at lower cost. And some of these new approaches provide that as a benefit as well. Demographics are having an impact. Of course, Generation Y and the millennials are telling us that they prefer to learn in different ways than what previous generations of employees have, and that's driving a big change in some of these approaches. There's always a need for competition. I think as technology and the business processes kind of level out and provide sort of equal advantages to many companies, knowledge and skills is still an area where a company can gain a competitive advantage. And if we can find new ways to get information and learning to people, that will help our client organizations that we work for become more competitive. And then finally, there's this continued transition to knowledge work. So as more and more work becomes information-driven and based on less and less on routine and procedural type of work, there's a need for knowledge and information to be available to help people make decisions and plan their work outcomes. So as we're making this transition to knowledge work, some estimates are about 40 to 50% now knowledge workers, especially in North America. This is all driving the need for new approaches to learning. So when you look at the right side of this image here, we need new learning to be fast, or let's say faster, available on demand, flexible to meet the needs of employees wherever they happen to be working, maybe a little bit more motivating and energizing than our traditional approaches to learning. There needs to be opportunities for, especially with the transition to knowledge work, for people to share their knowledge with others. So learning generated by users as much as by the training and development department, if you want to think of it that way. And there's a need for learning to be more collaborative and cost-effective. So these are the challenges that we have as learning professionals, and some of the things that are driving the new paths to learning that I'm talking about today. So let's start with informal learning, because it really is, as I mentioned earlier, the umbrella concept that envelops most of the other approaches. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when we ask employees, and there's been a number of studies like this is just one from Capital Works, when we ask employees how they've learned to do their work, the vast majorities tell us that it's through on-the-job experience. A smaller number say it's through interaction with coworkers, but of course that is part of on-the-job experience. And a smaller set say that it's through company-provided training. Now, most of this research says that company-provided training is critical, but the skills that it provides are quite temporary and maybe even fragile and awkward, actually, until people get a chance to use them on the job. And it's by using them on the job that they become refined and more robust over time. And I think that's where some of the focus for these new paths to learning can really help reinforce the skills that come from traditionally provided training and development. So let's start with a definition of informal learning. There's a lot out there, and part of my intention today is really to help demystify and simplify some of the definitions of these new approaches to learning that you may be hearing about. Really, we're loaded with a lot of promotion and talk and even outright evangelism around some of these new approaches to learning at the moment. But as you saw from that earlier ASTE research, there's really not a whole lot of it happening right now. So there's a lot of talk and a lot of positioning and a lot of trying to figure out how to make it work. So just to try to demystify this notion of informal learning, I'm going to define it very simply with 3 words: learning from experience. Now that can mean a lot of different things, but what I mean by that is, all of us, when we're working day to day, are exposed to information and feedback in many forms in our work environment that shapes our actions and our behavior, sometimes intentionally, through reflection on feedback and making adjustments in our own behavior, but also sometimes incidentally or unintentionally. So this experience is constantly shaping our knowledge, our expertise, sometimes in ways that we don't even know. These are the types of things that are the information and feedback that are available in our organization that helps us learn and at the same time perform our work. So we need to know what goals and expectations there are for us. So what is it that we need to do to perform well? What documents, resources, guides, performance tools are available to us? And that could include formal training as well. People surround us everywhere that we work, and most of us work in collaborative type environments now. So they're a source of both information and feedback from colleagues and experts that work in our organizations with us and outside our organization. Tools and technology are constantly driving information that's available to us in more timely, critically timely ways. Observing others is also a way that we all learn unintentionally even sometimes, and that kind of speaks to the culture of the organization. So we tend to imitate and learn from how others do their work. And then finally, there are consequences to the actions that we take. Sometimes those are unintentional as well. They're quite natural typically, and the more we can influence the kinds of consequences that people experience on the job, the more we can influence how they learn. So the challenge for learning and development professionals like ourselves is, how do we influence these variables to support learning. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this notion of informal learning is kind of an umbrella for the other approaches that we'll talk about. But all of those other approaches touch on one of these 6, and there's probably others as well, but one of these 6 sources of information and feedback that are in our daily experience. So the challenge to learning and development is how do we influence these variables to support learning, and some of the new paths do just that. So let's talk a little bit about social and mobile learning. I put them together, but I'll talk about them separately and then bring them together again. Talk about social learning first. And social learning, again, is one of those abstract concepts that's being talked about to death these days. But I'm going to limit my definition to the way it's typically being discussed, and that is in its relation to social media tools. So my definition is leveraging social media tools for learning and collaboration. Of course, there's lots of learning that takes place that is social in nature that doesn't involve social media tools. It's just social media tools these days are starting to enable social learning in ways that it hasn't been able to in the past. So the type of tools that we're talking about here are social software of the type that out there in the public sphere, like Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook, that provide platforms for people to share and discuss and talk to each other. Blogs, microblogs, which is really just another term for Twitter, and other types of very short ways of sharing information together. Media sharing like YouTube, wikis like Wikipedia, and various forms of online discussion and real-time chat. These are the types of tools that we're talking about when we talk about social media for learning. Now, those aren't learning tools in and of themselves, but the benefits that they bring to learning and development professionals like us is that they really are an environment that can enhance collaboration and sharing, and those two words alone are key terms when we're thinking about learning. They are the types of behaviors that we want to encourage, especially for informal learning on the job. So these social media tools allow people to learn while they're working. Again, that kind of informal sense of having access to tools, information, and feedback while they're working. And as important as information that we might seed or supply in these social learning environments, they're as important for creating knowledge and capturing knowledge. There's a new role for learning developers, I think, in capturing and curating knowledge from these social environments and then feeding it back in more structured forms to the organization. So in these environments, everyone's a teacher and everyone's a learner, and that's a good thing. So we want to try to encourage that. These are the types of tools that you typically think about when we think about social media tools, Facebook, LinkedIn, but these are public tools, and there's no doubt that some of them are being used internally inside our organizations for learning and development. But I think, and I'll go out on a limb here and suggest, if I can move my screen forward, there we go, that these are the types of social environments that you're going to start seeing very soon inside your organizations if you haven't already. I think what's happening, and this is a rapidly growing business, these are the top 10 or so internal social networking environments or social platforms. And because they offer greater security to organizations and specific functionality that's unique to what needs to be in place for business, I think like LMSs in the past, learning management systems in the past, these are the kinds of enterprise-wide platforms that are going to provide the environment for us to develop social learning kinds of tools. This is a very rapidly growing industry. The forecast from Forrester is that in about 3 years, this is going to be a $4 to $6 billion industry. Microsoft recently purchased Yammer, and a lot of organizations are starting to use Yammer internally as a social platform. Probably the #1 tool right now is IBM's Connections. But you see towards the bottom of your slide there's a study by Aberdeen Group just recently when they were looking at learning and social networking that's companies that are using these types of tools for learning and knowledge transfer are a very precise 53% more likely to achieve best-in-class results than those that do not. So I think we're starting to see companies that use these tools for learning are performing better than those that don't. Here's just an example, just to give you a flavor for what they might look like. We use Yammer internally at Global Knowledge. This is an example of how we do that. This is a community that I'm a part of that allows instructional designers and learning professionals inside Global Knowledge to talk to each other. You can see there that Eve Hearstay is an instructional designer working out of our U.S. office. Posted a little bit of information, just a link to a document on how to remove barriers to effective live virtual training. And she poses a few questions there. You can see the response below that from Rebecca Cummings, who is the leader of the Learning Solutions Group in the U.S. Basically says, thanks for posting. I'd like everybody on my team to take a look. And then that provokes a conversation where people have read the material and start a conversation around it. Now, that's just simple conversation happening within a community on one of these platforms, Yammer in particular. But it gives you a really quick feel for how learning can take place in quite an informal context, and actually while people are doing their work. So maybe Eve was looking at putting together a live virtual training webinar like we're participating in today. She found something on best practices and she shares that with the team. So that's the kind of thing that we want to encourage and create environments to support for informal learning. As we've started to learn a little bit ourselves at Global Knowledge, we've landed on 4 ways that we're helping our customers use social media for learning. I thought I'd share them with you. They really run the gamut from basically supporting formal learning all the way through to the most I guess, laissez-faire forms of informal learning. So let me share those with you now. One way, and it's probably the most common, is that informal learning and these social media platforms are being used to support formal learning programs. So we've got participants either in a live webinar like this or in a classroom environment, and running in conjunction with that program is a social media environment. And in that environment, you can use it for facilitated discussions and chat that run in parallel to the session, maybe run an Ask the Expert session. There may be videos, documents, even photos that are posted in that environment, links to blogs, articles, bookmarks. Really, it's wide open in terms of how you might bring your creative instructional design to using these tools to support the formal learning objectives in your classroom program. Now, also still on the formal learning side of things is maybe what we'll call it a collaborative learning use for social media. And this is where the social media environment itself is the defining environment. It's the equivalent of what we might have called distance education in the past. It is a formal learning program where there is an instructor leading the activities of a group of people learning together. But what those people do together are team case studies, team group activities, pre and post assignments, facilitated discussions, and chat. And all of that is the core of the learning program itself. So it's not an adjunct to a formal classroom program. It is the program. They typically run a little bit longer than a formal, say, 1, 2, 3-day learning program. A collaborative learning program might run weeks, where people are learning together over a period of time. The last two step into the more of an informal approach to learning, and the first is communities of practice, a term you may have heard of already. These are structured communities that are used to discuss, share, learn topics of common interest. So they can be loose associations of people. Let's say all of the managers in an organization have a loosely structured management community of practice. Or they can be quite tightly structured. Let's say a team of people that have come together on a task team and they have to solve a specific problem within a delimited amount of time. These are all forms of communities of practice, and they can use these social media tools to learn what they need while they're doing their work. So they can have either a learning focus, in which case they might be a more accurately labeled a learning community, or they can be a community of practice where really they're just a forum for people to actually accomplish their work objectives, and learning is more or less a byproduct. But very powerful concept. A lot of organizations are introducing communities of practice. They're especially useful for professional and knowledge worker groups that have access to this information and the technology needed to support it. And then finally, again, as I mentioned, sort of on the outside realm of informal learning is social business tools that are essentially the platforms that people are using to do their work. So those types of platforms I mentioned earlier are emerging as new enterprise tools for people to do their work, like sales platforms, customer CRM systems. They're becoming social environments, and simply in doing that, their learning is becoming a byproduct of the collaboration that people experience when they're using these tools. So the new role for learning and development is to participate a little bit in these environments on the side and work with the members of these communities and teams to extract the key learnings that come out of them, structure them, and feed them back into the organization as best practices. So these are 4 ways that at Global Knowledge we're looking at helping our customers use social media for learning, and trying to bring some clarity to the discussion around how social media can be used. Let's move on to mobile learning. Also, I think as, just to take a little detour here, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, we're not taking questions during the session, but we will take a few questions towards the end of the session. So please use the chat tool that you have available and ask any question that you'd like at any point during the session. We'll make an attempt to answer it at the end. And if we don't, we'll hopefully be able to get back to you personally and answer that question for you. So on the mobile learning, just a quick definition again. What we're talking about here, mobile learning is defined really more by the devices than it is by the software that enables all of this, although they work together in unison. But really we're talking about leveraging mobile devices, and by that we mean smartphones, tablets, and even laptop computers. Anything that enables remote learning and support for remote workers. Now, more and more people have tablets and smartphones at work day to day, so there's no reason that people have to be remote to access this, but that's where some of the benefits lie. So the key benefits of mobile learning are reach, of course. We can get on demand, just in time, and I would also add to that, just enough information to people when they need it at that precise moment. So speed of learning, access to information when it's needed, and on top of all of that, all of these devices are basically access tools to social learning as well. So they provide a vehicle to those communities and social platforms I was talking about earlier. One of the issues that's sort of being played out right now in mobile learning is whether to move to applications that sit on the tool itself, or developing applications that, these are learning applications I'm talking about now, but it also applies to any other business type of application. So applications that either sit on the platform itself or are available on the web or in the cloud that can be accessed by these devices. So that is being played out in the industry right now. At Global Knowledge, we've landed on sort of the web side of things because we believe that there's going to be a lot of different devices that are available inside organizations. We're already seeing it with bring your own device kinds of programs that are being introduced. And so you won't always be able to develop and roll out the apps that you might want across all of those devices, especially when you're looking at extending even outside of your organization. So this is the way we're starting to think about mobile learning. Development of digital learning and reference content. And I would almost say, especially for devices like a smartphone, I think reference content, easily accessible, nicely indexed, easily searched, is as important as, let's say, developing an interactive e-learning program that's meant for delivery via mobile. I think the real estate or the screen space that you have available on some of these small devices is not really appropriate for the interaction that's needed for an e-learning program, whereas that would be true in a tablet environment. Just as an example, here's something that we're developing for a real estate association. This is essentially an e-learning program. It has loads of documentation and information available as well. But I highlighted here just to show you the difference in the navigation that's necessary. So if you have traditional e-learning developers looking at developing for mobile delivery, it's not just a simple conversion. You really do need to think of, look at the size of the arrows over in the navigation on the right. They have to be large enough for the fingers that are tapping your tablet screens. And there's a number of other types of navigational issues that are important and usability issues that are important when you're considering the development of mobile learning. But it can be an absolute godsend when it comes to getting learning and information to remote workers that you have, sales, maybe field engineers, anybody out there in front of a customer that doesn't have access to the kind of information that employees working internally do. And even if you're providing that kind of training through traditional forms, they certainly aren't able to get into the office to take it as frequently as internal employees. So moving on to virtual learning, and I'm going through these quite quickly. Today, really, this is just a scan, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to demystify and clarify some of these terms in ways that might be useful to you as a practitioner. So I'm going through them at a bit of a pace here, and hopefully that works for you. Virtual learning is really not informal learning at all, but it's certainly leveraging technology to take advantage of delivering training remotely, and some of the new technologies are actually allowing us to get more informal in our approaches to doing that. So just by definition, you've probably all participated in virtual learning. You're participating in a variation of it right now, actually. It's essentially instructor-led, live, online learning. And that includes what we are all, most of us anyway, I think are familiar with in terms of online webinars and training using tools like WebEx, GoToMeeting, which we're using here right now. And we also use Adobe Connect. These are tools that allow us to deliver training to remote participants with an instructor in one location. So it is a broadcast in a way of an instructor to people in remote locations using these tools. But there's a movement, and quite an interesting one, to start to create more immersive experiences using virtual learning tools and some of the concepts from virtual reality. So if you're familiar with ideas like or tools like Second Life, for example, where you participate in a whole another virtual environment and you have an avatar that you control that represents you in this environment. These are some of the approaches that are emerging now to support virtual learning. And there's another called the Connected Classroom, which I'll share with you in a moment. But the key benefits of virtual learning, of course, are basically reach, getting to people in remote locations without incurring the cost of travel. That's been the huge benefit of virtual learning. So it allows you to do traditional training at low cost and reach a lot of people, which brings a lot of flexibility to the people, to your learners and students. And some of these new forms of learning that I'm going to show you in a moment start to increase engagement and motivation levels through these virtual learning programs as well. So we do a lot of work with Tellus. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Dan Pontefract, who's the head of learning and collaboration at Tellus. We do quite a bit of work with Dan. This is Tellus's collaboration house, which is their form of virtual learning. I've just got a couple of screenshots here for you. Collaboration House is what they've labeled this environment. So it's basically built on a platform from Avaya, a virtual learning virtual platform from Avaya. Participants enter Collaboration House and assemble in this common area. This is a couple of screenshots from a meeting that we were participating in not that long ago. And you can see there's stairs up to various other rooms that have sort of different types of functions associated with them. So in this case, the team gathered in one of the conference room where Dan, you can see there, was doing a presentation on informal learning at Tellus. And so this is, and you can see that there's a number of other, I'm in there someplace. Yes, there I am, Tom. This is an environment where, like Second Life, you manipulate your avatar through this virtual space. And it's a very interesting way to create improved engagement. You can present information in all the traditional ways, and in the same way that you can start to introduce unique ways to get people to work together in small groups, you can do the same thing in these virtual environments. So another way to use virtual training to increase motivation and engagement. The other thing that we're experimenting with at Global Knowledge and having some really significant success is what we call C&V learning, which is classroom and virtual together. So in this case, we have instructors in remote locations, or in various locations around the world, really, that are delivering a traditional classroom session in a training facility with an instructor and a live classroom in front of him or her. But there are a number of remote students that are coming into that classroom environment and participating in the classroom activities via the internet. And together, both the classroom participants and the remote participants can participate in remote labs, especially for our technical training as well. So in this way, we're creating, instead of one instructor broadcasting to many, we have remote students coming in from outside and participating virtually in the dynamics of a classroom environment. And we have technology that's supporting that. So that's another approach to virtual learning that's sort of pushing the limits of technology and taking advantage of cloud internet technologies. Moving on to gaming, which is on the top of mind for a lot of people working in learning development, and I've combined it here with simulation. They're similar concepts that are talked about together sometimes, but they do have different purposes. So we'll start with gaming. And gamification, for better or for worse, sometimes some people think that's a cringeworthy term, but it's certainly a language that's starting to emerge out there. And the notion is, and my short definition here is that we're applying game strategies, game structures that are being borrowed from the video gaming world. So these game strategies and mechanics are being applied to games designed to achieve learning outcomes. There's a whole lot of gamification happening right now in business. So for sales and business processes, there are these kind of mechanisms to reward and motivate people through the gamification of business processes. So the notion here is to use those same approaches for learning and development. I'll just highlight a few of the different types of gamification or games that we see out there. First, there is the difference between independent games, which most of us through e-learning that we've done or taken over time are familiar with. These are the types of, I'll just show you a quick example here of, in this case, this is a game that we put together, an independent learning game based on the Snakes and Ladders model that we did for a critical thinking program with Government of Alberta. This is part of the award-winning program that I mentioned earlier. But those are independent games, so we're all familiar with those. But what's changing right now is that some of the gamification that's taking place inside organization are bringing a social element to it. And there are two ways that seems to be happening. One is that the game itself has learning built into it. So while you're participating in the game, you are accomplishing learning goals. You're engaging in activities that are similar to what you need to learn on the job. The second approach, though, which is becoming more and more popular, is using gaming to motivate traditional learning. And we'll talk about that in a sec. But the benefits of these approaches are, of course, the key benefit is engagement. You know, we're all looking for ways to engage the Generation Y demographic, and not just I mean, we're learning that everybody loves playing games, whether it's Angry Birds to anything that happens to be on your tablet or smartphone right now. So the motivation and engagement that this approach creates is causing learning to be more effective. There are platforms that are being developed not just for learning but for gamification, and learning is taking advantage of these platforms. We're actually building one ourselves for a client that we have in the resource industry, and we're hoping to leverage with other clients as well. But platforms like Badgeville, Bunchball, Big Door, these are platforms that are being used to gamify business processes, but learning professionals like ourselves are jumping on board as well to use them to gamify learning. So let me just walk through what that structure might look like. You can see in this slide here that the learning content down in the bottom left is quite separate from the game structures that are in place for this model that we can take advantage of. So by traditional learning content, I'm talking about everything from documents to formal online e-learning and even classroom learning, or even sending learners out into the organization to talk and work with experts that exist in the company. The notion is to provide a number of learning challenges, and those challenges are often basically sending them to learning content, existing learning programs. You bundle those learning challenges into different levels of difficulty, typically levels of difficulty, but those levels can also be different types of learning. Let's say you know, you're learning about a sales process first, and then maybe learning about product knowledge in another different challenge level. So there are a number of challenge levels. As learners work through the challenge levels, they acquire and earn points and rewards. So this is the motivating aspect of it. And as they earn those points and rewards, they move up or down social competition devices like leaderboards. So the whole idea here is to actually motivate learners to access and use existing learning content, which is quite different from developing a learning game in and of itself. But it's very definitely growing in popularity, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it. I'm going to move on to simulations now. Again, quite a simple definition. I think most of us have been involved in a simulation, either online or physical, in some form or other. But the intent is to immerse learners in authentic, real-world tasks and scenarios and problems that are based on real work processes. And in doing so, the key benefits of that are that our learners are allowed to engage in authentic practice, so they're practicing something that is very real that they'll be doing on the job, and in doing so, they receive very rich feedback from that process. So it's feedback that is as authentic as the practice. So things like these types of simulations, again, target engagement and motivation, but very specifically, you know, the best kind of learning, of course, is learning where people are very quickly apply and gain feedback on what they're learning. And this creates rich environments for them to apply their skills. There are different types of simulations, and often we think of online simulations as behavioral simulations, but that's not always the case. There are system and process types of simulations where people are immersed in a system and have to manipulate variables in the system to see and learn outcomes. There are behavioral types of simulations where people have to make decisions and see the results of their choices. We've done both. This is just a quick example of something we did for a simulation we did for NAV Canada air traffic controllers. And you can see it's not really behavioral. It's a control panel that's available to them. This means very little to me, and I'm sure to you as well. But they manipulate these controls, and in doing so, they are the controls that they have to manipulate in their job, but they experience the consequences in a risk-free environment if they do it in an online simulation like this. And in doing so, they're getting that kind of feedback that I mentioned at the top of the presentation that is available in the organization to help them learn their work, they're essentially learning what they're doing correctly and incorrectly in a safe environment. This is a very different type of simulation. It's part of that award-winning program that we did for Alberta Human Services. It's essentially a program on critical thinking for caseworkers, social workers in Alberta that have to make quite difficult and significant decisions like when to take a child out of a home, an abusive home. These are critical decisions that need to be made based on a lot of information and data. So what we did was created quite a simple simulation in the end. It was based on text and images, but what makes it highly useful and profound for them was the authentic nature of the questions and feedback that they receive in answer to those questions. So this is an example of a simple but powerful behavioral simulation. And moving on finally to performance support. Performance support is a term that's been around for a little while. What it really means, though, it's a sort of a grab-all term for a number of different types of tools and guides that are we can make available on the job. So really, it's real-time guidance and support of work tasks, and it's most effective when it's driven by job roles and business processes. In the past, in maybe the knowledge management movement of a few years ago, there was a lot of this type of information that was made available to people, but it ended up sitting sort of in information graveyards, if we want to think of it that way. And the advantage of some of the new social media platforms as a home for these performance support tools is it allows us to realize and see what's being used and what's not being used, for people to add their own guides and support tools, and it becomes more of an organic environment, and where the best of these tools rises to the top based on usage. So some examples are simple process guides, asking an expert, electronic reference tools, coaches and advisors that can be put together to guide individual performance, decision aids, and even any number of learning assets. We're starting to break down actually some of our classroom-based programs into their components and seed social learning environments for this to meet this performance support kind of purpose. The benefits are essentially you're embedding knowledge right in the workflow, right in the business processes. So again, it has that advantage of just enough, just-in-time information. And when it's done well, when performance support is done well, it can reduce the requirement for training, because essentially you're providing guidance and tools to help people do their job. And if it's done really well, and in certain types of circumstances, it can even replace training. So performance support is a very important concept that's been around for a while, but it's being enhanced through some of the social platforms. This is just a quick example of how we're starting to break down some of our formal learning content into small chunks. This is just a very simple web-based, we call them learning advisors. This is a piece of a program that we have on delegation, and it just highlights quick hit information and models on how to effectively delegate. But an end user can come into an environment like a little piece like this, and we call it a learning asset, navigate through it in a few minutes and come back to it whenever they're ready. So it provides much more of a just-in-time, on-demand approach to knowledge. So just in summary, and I'm going to leave a little bit of time here for some questions. Just to summarize the new paths to learning and when it might make the most sense to use them. I've touched on this a little bit during the as we've talked about each of them. Social learning, and I guess by that, as I mentioned earlier, I mean the use of social media tools. And in particular, I think we're going to start to see some of these internal, behind the firewall, enterprise social media platforms. These are very useful for us as learning professionals, for knowledge and professional workers, managers, professional engineers, learning professionals, instructional designers, anybody that needs to work and collaborate together to produce their work outcomes are a prime candidate for social learning. Also, they're more appropriate, I would say, for experts or people with longer-term experience than they are for novices. Novices can participate in these environments and they learn quite a bit while they're in them, but anybody learning a new task or a new job, most research has shown that novices both prefer and learn more effectively from formal training. So they're also great for encouraging collaboration to create new knowledge. So as these professional workers participate in these environments, they create new best practices that we as learning professionals and members of the team can work together to create new best practices that can be shared in the organization. Mobile learning, again, highly targeted at mobile employees. Definitely if you had a moment of need, on-demand type of information requirement, that's where they're best to use. And mobile learning really is just an access these days to various types of social learning as well. So all those social learning platforms we were just talking about are accessible via mobile learning. Virtual learning is essentially formal learning, but it's great for getting consistent information and training out to large numbers of people that are geographically dispersed. So the larger your organization, the more virtual learning is going to be useful to you. Gamification and even simulation, very relevant for improving engagement and motivation and rewarding, essentially, rewarding training. So if you're trying to improve access to training and improve your the volume of training you're doing in your organization, gamification might be something to consider. Simulation is fantastic for practice in risk-free environments, and performance support, again, is something that can be blended with all of the other methods discussed above and is great for guiding performance in real time and use in post-formal training situations. So that, kind of in a nutshell, and is and in very rapid-fire mode, is the 5 or 6 new paths to learning that we're exploring and starting to work with some of our clients with, and would love to work with you on. So that leaves us about 5 or 10 minutes here to answer some questions. I think if you haven't already, use the chat feature that you have in your window, and I believe Sarah has been collecting some of the questions and might have a couple to ask now.
Yep, we do have a couple of questions, Tom. One from Wilson: would SharePoint wiki sites qualify as a social learning tool?
Great question, Wilson. I mean, I would say yes. People have different thoughts about the use of SharePoint as a social media platform, but certainly the newest versions of SharePoint have moved in the social direction. It's just a much more structured environment than other types of social environments. And I think, Wilson, you referred specifically to the wiki feature in SharePoint. And wikis in particular are meant for collaborating on a document. So it certainly encourages the kind of collaboration and the learning as a byproduct we talked about earlier. But you know, really what you're doing in using that wiki is creating documentation together. There will be learning that happens as a result of that, but you might want to think about how to use that wiki to create more performance support tools and guides that have a learning purpose. So I'd say, yeah, absolutely, but I guess it all depends on how you use it to accomplish a learning goal.
Great. We do have another question, Tom, from Kim. How do we encourage our organizations to embrace or buy into these new paths to learning?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kim. I mean, really, the whole notion of encouraging an organization to buy into learning, to these forms of learning, it really has to take it maybe even a notch up. And the ultimate question is, how important is learning for your organization? So you go right back to those business drivers that I mentioned earlier. So if your organization is struggling with innovation, productivity, the amount of learning that you're getting to people through traditional forms of classroom or e-learning is just not hitting the mark, people aren't able to access learning when they need it, and if skills are a critical competitive factor in your industry and your company, then these are the kinds of arguments that you need to make for learning in general. These types of new paths to learning just improve flexibility and access to information and collaboration. So I would focus really on those types of features like flexibility, access and reach, and the byproduct of learning that comes from collaborating together. It gets people learning as much from each other as they do from the limited resources that might be available in the learning department. There are different, people have taken a crack at ROI for some of these social media platforms, but that's a difficult nut to crack because at some point these social platforms are just going to be very present in organization, and it'll be like asking, what's the ROI of email, and it's just very, very large. So you're going to have to end up looking at ROI for each individual learning initiative. A long-winded question to a short answer. Sorry about that.
No, that's great, Tom. I do have one last question. Simona asks, you mentioned novices versus experts. Is there a recommendation on determining what type of learning to use for a specific audience? For example, shop floor operators versus office personnel. Some people may not perform well in a classroom, but would be great at computer games or social media.
Yeah, that's another great question. I think there's just a lot of research that has shown that novices, and I use that term broadly, so a novice can be anybody from somebody that's new to an organization or new to a profession or even new to a specific task. So it's the idea that a novice is somebody that's coming brand new to a best practice that they need to learn. And that can be operational kinds of things like you just mentioned, or it can be somebody that's new to management, for example. Most of the research shows that at least a certain amount of formal learning is critical to get those foundational skills in place that can be refined later through some of these more informal approaches to learning. But if you're talking about operational skills, these kinds of procedural, routine, operational, on-the-job learning, there's really options for both types of formal and informal there. But I would say even you'd be looking at formal learning in the form of e-learning. If it's not in the classroom, even formal learning, formal on-the-job training in the form of like an apprenticeship or a coach helping the individual learn the very specific tasks that they need to learn before they're able to contribute to something, to a broader community of practice or participate in a simulation which would require them to apply skills that they might have learned through a formal program.
So, Tom, is there a way that works best to introduce change and the learning associated with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, most of the research and practice, the anecdotal evidence that we have on that is to start small and demonstrate success. So instead of making a large and public and vocal transformation from formal learning to these types of new paths to learning, I think it's better to start small with a defined group where you have a good chance of success, support it like crazy so you do achieve that success, and then use that to build slowly to other forms. So start small, achieve success, and then communicate that success through the organization.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Thanks for attending.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone that we will be sending out a link with today's recording as soon as it's available. If you do have any questions, feel free to respond to that email at any time and we'll get you an answer with Tom. Thank you so much, everyone. You can now disconnect.